an archaeologist. I mean, I think it's fascinating to discover the past. When I went to the town Capernaum on the northern shores of Galilee, where Jesus is known to have lived, it was like his home base. And archaeologists have discovered what they think was the house of his disciple Peter, who was living there with his wife and his mother, or possibly mother-in-law. And that was the home base where Christ sort of went out and did his teaching. He'd always go back to Peter's house. And it's fascinating. The church has now built a huge basilica over it, which would seat 1,000 people. But the floor is made of glass, and you can look down at the archaeological remains of the actual house where Peter and Jesus would have had evening meals and chats, and the other disciples. So that's another reason archaeology is fascinating. They're discovering stuff. Okay, so you probably have gathered by now, I don't believe in... There is a tradition in intellectual history that said Jesus never existed. There was nobody called Jesus. It's all made up stories. It was a plot. Different people say different plots, were involved. But there couldn't have been a Jesus, and therefore he didn't exist, and prove it. Well, okay, that's another... I don't agree with that theory, because having gone into it, I think there's huge amounts of evidence that there was a chap called Jesus, and that what it says he was doing in the Gospels is by and large probably historically grounded. But, so one of the questions biblical studies ask is, what are the other references to Jesus? Is he talked about in other books of the time? And the answer is yes. He's talked about by the Roman historian Tacitus. He's talked about by Josephus, who was a Jewish historian who wrote a great history of the Jewish wars against Rome. Because it's thought Jesus died in about 36 AD. He was about 36 when he died, if he was born to complicate things, they now think he was born in actually 6 BC, because the guy that invented the BC AD system of dating miscalculated the dates. So Jesus was born 6 years before he was born, which complicates everything, but it's quite fun. But he is thought to have died in about 36 AD, and so he was still quite young, about 40, late 30s, 40. And then after that, about 30 years later, one of the themes in Jesus' lifetime was this simmering tension between the Jews and the Romans, who were the colonial oppressors. The Romans were ruling that part of the world. They called it Judea. They ruled it from a port city called Caesarea, which I've been to, which had been built by Herod the Great, who was like a client king. Herod was not Jewish. He was from a sort of Idumean background, which was more from a desert tribe, more Arab if you want. But he pretended to be Jewish, and he supported the idea of having Judea, but he'd been a placement put there by the Roman emperors. And he liked that because that gave him total power. Anyone that disagreed with him, he had arrested and, killed off. Like, he was a tyrant. But he was typical of that genre of tyrant in the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire was run as a tyranny by the emperor. Caesar, when he conquered Gaul, he slaughtered anyone that didn't agree with him, like the Druids, mass genocide of the Druids. And yet he was an intelligent man who thought he was bringing civilization to Gaul. So it's a double-edged thing. The tension in Judea with the Romans, there were different forces and factions. Some said you should fight the Romans. Some of the Jews set up guerrilla groups which would meet at night and kill a few officers off the battlements and arm themselves with daggers and slings or whatever, called the Sicarii or the Zealots. And they were like the revolutionary leaders who thought they should fight for freedom against the Romans. Others loved the Romans and became totally Romanophiles, went to all the best parties, dressed up in the latest togas, learned Latin, read Roman literature, and look down on their Jewish counterparts as semi-barbarians because, God, they're like sheep farmers. And we, Roman-loving Jews, were much more sophisticated. Okay, and then there was... But the trouble was they ended up sort of supporting the Romans in their oppression of the Jewish people, who were always being taxed and hassled if you didn't have the right paperwork. A bit like the average Palestinian now in Bethlehem. If you're wandering about the street without the right paperwork, you get put in prison by the Israeli army. As I've seen, I've walked around Bethlehem and I've met Palestinians who've told me. Well, that's kind of what was happening in the streets of Judea. Ironically, the Israeli army is now sort of playing the function of the Roman army, oppressing the Bedouin and the Palestinians. History has a funny way of turning into its opposite, which was one of the laws that Karl Marx pointed out. Engels called it dialectic, how things turn into its opposite. So today's liberational force becomes an oppressive force in time, which is kind of what happened to Christianity. It starts out as a liberational force in the mind and heart of Jesus and the disciples, but then it becomes an oppressive force in the hands of an official church that then punishes and imprisons and tortures if you're a heretic. It's that bouleversement, as the French say, that interests me in studying as a historian, that dialectical movement. So how can we know about all this? Let's just go back a bit. If we were embarking on a course in biblical studies, what tools can we have on the table? Well, we've got everything I've described. We've got the archaeological maps, we've got the latest finds and discoveries, we've got the Bible text itself, which we have read before we could come to the university course. We've studied how it built up over many years. We have, for the life of Christ, we have 4 first-hand accounts called Gospels, which are really important. You have to read those before you can even come to the class, right? And each is slightly different. What's really interesting about the Gospels is that they all tell a slightly different story. It's as if the same guy giving a lecture had 4 cameras from different angles and different heights, running on slightly different speeds, with interspersed bits, because at a certain point the camera's shut down, they go off and film the scenery, And that's kind of what you got in the Gospels. The story's pretty much the same. Many of the same events happen, but they're given a slightly different angle. And some Gospels have stuff that the others don't have. I love them all. I've done a detailed commentary on each of the 4 Gospels, which is on my Green University website, which took me like a year to study and teach the whole. And I went through them line by line, explaining why in that Gospel it says it that way and why in this other one it says it another way. Now that's detailed biblical studies for the New Testament, right? What were they written in, these Gospels? Well, the Gospel of St. Matthew, probably Aramaic, might have been the original one. Jesus and the disciples spoke Aramaic, which is a form of the Semitic language very close to Hebrew, but not identical with it. And it had its own alphabet, just to complicate everything. And it was probably the language that Abraham spoke before Hebrew officially was born. Abraham was speaking a form of Aramaic, which is very interesting. And that was the mother tongue of Christ. Not all his disciples probably spoke it, although most of them did. Some of them certainly spoke Greek, if not all of them, because Greek was the language of civilized cultural, intellectual discourse in that region. And some of their names, like Andreas, Philip, they're Greek names. And so some of these disciples of Jesus were Greek. And so they would have spoken Greek because it was the intellectual language of educated people. Some would have spoken forms of Latin just to talk to the local soldiers. If Christ was part of a building business with his dad in his youth, which he probably was, they would have had to go on and do measurements and chat to the rich people who were all speaking Latin about what kind of roof do you want? Do you want tiles? What colour tiles? That kind of thing. How do you want the fountain in the? And one of the biggest building projects in the day was a place called Sepphoris, which is in the Galilee, which was being turned into a masterpiece city. I've been there. Archaeologists have dug it up and discovered the ruins from the time of Christ. It was employing loads of builders and architects and designers, and he probably worked there, and so would have had to have some Latin to be able to communicate, for work. So I think one thing we learn with Jesus is he was multi-skilled and multi-linguistic. He was probably fluent in Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew, semi-fluent, if not fluent, in Latin, because there are many exchanges in the Gospels where he's talking to Roman centurions in detail about how to heal their daughter or whatever, and they came to him and asked, So I think that gives us a clue to his personality, which was, we would now call him an internationalist or a cosmopolitan. He wasn't a sort of narrow racist type that said, no, my language is the best, just speak my language. He was trying to build bridges between the Hellenistic culture, which spoke Greek, the Roman culture, which spoke Latin, the Hebrew culture, or the Jewish culture, which spoke Hebrew, and the sort of local culture, which all spoke Aramaic, or that was a descendant of Canaanite, really. Okay, he might have also travelled elsewhere to complicate things, but we'll come to that in a minute. So Matthew, I like Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. It's one of my favourites. They're all my favourite. Matthew's amazing because by tradition it was written by the chap that ran the toll booth on the road between northern Galilee, which went through Capernaum, and it went all the way through to Syria, Edessa, and then ultimately through to northern India. And another branch took it to China. It was a great trade route, like the Silk Road, coming through Galilee. And then it went onto the coast, either at Caesarea, or, you could catch a ship there to Cyprus or Marseille or whatever. So this thing that Jesus came from a backwater where nobody could say boo to a goose is wrong. He came from an international centre of trade. And Galilee was an exciting place to be because it was away enough from Jerusalem, which had a sort of one-size-fits-all policy with its new temple. It was in the country, a bit like La Creuse. We're like the Galilee of France. Okay. So the Gospel of St. Matthew, written by the guy running the toll booth in Galilee, in Capernaum, that northern part of Galilee. And he met Jesus just when he was out and about teaching. And he decided this guy was a clever rabbi, because he was a learned guy. He was a believer in the God of Abraham and Moses and the whole story of the scrolls that he'd read. And in those days there were no books. It was, you read scrolls, right? He could read in those languages. And he thought that, well, no, this Jesus guy is really quite something. He's a serious rabbi. So he gave up his quite nice little number, taking the tolls as people walked up and down the road, merchants. And he decided to devote himself to Christ and his work, his mission. And he kept notes. So that became and grew into the Gospel of St. Matthew, which begins with proving that Jesus is a descendant of David and indirectly a son of Abraham. And he starts with, Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah, and so on and so on and so on. You go all the way down to, and Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. Of her was born Jesus, who was called Christ. So, that's the first opening bit of Matthew, which is like proving Jesus was actually descended from Abraham. Another story that's in Matthew very early on, which I love, is the visit of the three Magi. And this is a very important story in the birth of Christianity, because Jesus has been born miraculously. There seems to have been something strange about Jesus' birth. He was born to a woman called Mary who was quite young, who'd been serving as a temple assistant in Jerusalem. She was from a very devout family who believed in, the mission of the Hebrew people to anchor the kingdom of God on earth. I mean, going back to Moses and Abraham, they were on mission to create a paradise. And Jerusalem temple was supposed to be the epicenter of it. And Mary was there as a young girl from about the age of 8, possibly even younger, serving in the temple. That meant lighting the candles, helping the food, making sure pilgrims are happy, dusting down stuff when it got too dusty or whatever. And studying. She would have been literate. You couldn't work in that environment without wanting to read the scrolls. And then she was, according to Matthew, something miraculous happened. And she was got together with an older chap called Joseph, who was old enough to be her father. This is what the legend says. And you have to supplement the biblical story with other scripts and other writings that parallel it. And there's a book called the Proto-Evangelium, which I've read, I've got it on the shelves, which tells this backstory of who Mary was and where she came from. And it's not in the actual Bible, which is annoying and frustrating. I think the Proto-Evangelium should be printed in the Bible as well, because it tells the real story. But anyway, the story is that she had some miraculous conception. Jesus was not conceived through a normal, falling in love, getting married and having a baby type thing. It was more, depending on how you interpret it, she was told by an angel that she was going to conceive the Messiah. The what? Well, somebody that was going to make everything all right in the world, was going to heal the relationship between man and God, which had got fractured because of our never listening to the law, the teachings. And even people that claimed to be Jewish were now corrupt. Even people that claimed to be wise were just misusing their positions and stuff. So God decides in the very beginning of this story to send this, I like to think of the Messiah as a secret agent of God. Like a secret agent on mission to humanity to make things right again. And the circumstance of how Mary conceived, was it the angel? I mean, I've got books that on the Christian shelves that say, well, it was UFOs, it was visiting spacemen that gave her a baby, and Jesus was half alien, and that's why he was a super king, because he was from an omniscient planet where people are really enlightened. I mean, that's one theory. There are other theories. Anyway, the story is that she was found to be pregnant. The temple were terribly embarrassed because one of their top nice girls was now pregnant. And she told them the story, no, it was the Holy Spirit. And they, what? That I don't see that in any books, They didn't really believe it. But they didn't want to embarrass anyone, so they married her off to this older guy, Joseph, who came forward and volunteered. And then she was sent off, in the country, hoping the embarrassment would die down. And then the story, of course, is that she goes to Bethlehem to be born, for Jesus to be born. And then these 3 Magi turn up. Now, King Herod, who was the king at the time, big, powerful king, tyrant chap, he'd heard rumours that there was going to be a Messiah born. And he had his counter-espionage working. Like, he didn't want a saviour to come, because that would cause him and his throne and his security and his power to be upended. So he thought of the typical tyrant solution, which is, well, the astrologers on the way to the birthplace of Jesus, these three magi, he said to them very politely, said, tell you what, you go and find out where he's born and come back and tell me. Thinking, well, he'd send his troops in and get the guy killed off, the baby. But in fact, the wise men were clever, so they went home a different way, the magi. And it's interesting that in the Celtic Bible, the Gaelic Bible, the word is 3 druids came to see Jesus, these 3 magi. But an angel appears to Joseph in a dream and says, get up, take the child and his mother with you and escape into Egypt and stay there, because Herod intends to search for the child and do away with him. Well, that's kind of typical of the tyrant. And what he does, he sends in a squad of soldiers to kill every single baby in Bethlehem, in case any of them's the Messiah. And that's called the Massacre of the Innocents, and it's celebrated by the church to this day every year. So it shows you that Jesus was born in it was not a comfortable world he was coming into. He was from quite an important parentage, who had links to the temple. He was from a lineage that was quite spiritually charged, probably going all the way back to King David and Abraham. And the evil forces, represented by Herod and the tyrants, right from the beginning wanted to kill him off. I mean, that's quite a heavy karma to be born into. Normally, we're born and our parents love us and, we get a few years of childhood before reality starts, and you have to go and get a job. But Jesus didn't have that. Right from like the 4th day, he's on the back of a camel heading off to Egypt with his parents afraid for his life. Anyway, and that's all in Matthew. So Matthew he's trying to tell the story as he knows it. Those stories must have been told to Jesus as a boy. How would he know that he was taken to Egypt as a baby? Well, his parents would have told him. And that's, he would have told his disciples. So those stories were circulating in the early Sangha, or the community of early Christians around Jesus, including Matthew. And that's why they got written down. One of the most exciting things about biblical studies is going into these stories in detail, looking at the original text in Greek and sometimes Aramaic and Hebrew, and comparing and contrasting all the 4 Gospels, and then seeing which is the original one. What this story is slightly different in this Gospel. What was the original source one? And this version of biblical studies has been going on for like 200 years. It was big in Germany in the 19th century, where whole university departments were studying New Testament criticism and trying to reconstruct the original text. And it's fascinating, and it's led to some very interesting insights. Okay, I'm going to pause there. We're sort of halfway, and we'll have some questions.